All my artwork represents my inner life. It's an expression of what goes on inside me and a vehicle for telling my story. Because my story is at the centre of my art, I'd like to share it with you. Everyone has a story, this just happens to be mine. At this point, I'd like you to be aware that my story covers some confronting themes. I grew up in New South Wales in cult-like conditions. My father was deeply controlling and strict, and my mother was emotionally distant and unpredictable. I was raised to be moulded into my parents' expectations. If I didn't get it right, there were severe consequences. I also lived with childhood sexual assault. Being a child in this kind of household meant there was no room to grow my own thoughts, my own voice, my own identity, or my own sense of self. My life and my body didn't belong to me. They belonged to somebody else, and so I believed I was nothing. I set off into adulthood with no idea about how to live or love, with the ideas that I had no voice and I was nothing firmly entrenched in my mind. I was traumatised and suffering from mental illness. I had the overwhelming need to excel at everything, just in case someone would be proud of me. I got a teaching job at one of the top schools in Perth. I thought that would make my parents proud. My mother said, "I hope you can manage it." I started to cut myself. I met a man in a pub. He seemed nice. He smiled at me a lot. A year later, we were married. We were on our honeymoon when he started to hit me, and then began introducing me to drugs and porn. I earned all the money in the relationship, but was given a $5 weekly allowance. After a few years, I found the courage to run. I jumped on a plane with one change of clothes and headed to the eastern states. A week later, I was walking around a corner only to find him standing there. He dragged me home. 6 years later, he found someone else. I could finally get a divorce. I left the marriage with nothing. I then had the opportunity to head north to a remote Aboriginal community to set up a school. I loved it. There was so much freedom, no rules. The only thing that limited our activities was that we had to have access to water. But that life came crashing in because it challenged everything I had ever known, and I had no strategies within me to cope. I attempted suicide, then I tried again, and 2 more times. During this time I started counselling, but my heart wasn't in it. I lived carelessly, and I became homeless. After another attempted suicide that left me in a coma for 3 days, I finally had an epiphany. I started working hard in therapy, started to understand how my mind had been moulded and the way I saw myself. It was hard. At 32, I fell pregnant. When I was 5 months along, I woke up one morning to find the father packing bags. He said, "I'm going home to my wife." I never saw him again. I became a single mother. When my son was around 6 years old, we moved down to Mandurah. I had a teaching job. Initially, we settled in quite nicely, but since being there, I moved through 5 jobs. They were mostly unfair dismissals, but I still didn't have a voice, and I was trash. I attempted suicide 2 more times. Throughout this time, however, I continued therapy and have now been in counselling for 25 years, still working hard, still facing myself and recreating myself. I can't change the things that happened to me. I can only change the way I was taught to think. I can now create myself so I'm not defined by those things. I don't have to be what I was moulded into. I can be the person I have created. I can be me. I've been given many labels over the years. I have dysthymia, a fancy word for lifelong depression, borderline personality disorder, PTSD, anxiety. Could go on. But I don't define myself in these ways either. I recreated myself to be the best mum I knew how, and my now 22-year-old son is a solid, self-aware man who is following his dreams, working with teens, giving them hope. I'm deeply proud of him. I also recreated myself to become a full-time artist, and I love it. So, finally to the dress. Thank you for listening to my story. So the dress I created for this exhibition is deeply meaningful to me. It is an extension of my recreation. It is a reframing of my childhood, full of joy, laughter and freedom. I wanted the dress to look like a small child had drawn it with simplicity and love. Thank you.